Zuri Harper tried to stop a police officer from hurting a defenseless man, but instead of being thanked, she was arrested and dragged into court. There, a white judge looked her in the eye and called her a liar. What happens when a young black woman stands her ground while hiding one truth that could change everything? She's the daughter of the state's attorney general. What would you do if telling the truth cost you everything? If that question makes you pause, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, because this story is one you won't forget. It didn't sound like a scream. It sounded like something snapping, like bone against stone. Denzel Moore hit the pavement face first, arms twisted behind his back, blood streaking down his temple before anyone could even call it violence. He didn't resist. God knows he didn't have the strength. He barely had a coat. The man was thin, older, exhausted in a way only the street can do to someone. But none of that mattered to Officer John Beckett. The man had his knee pressed between Denzel's shoulder blades, grinding down like he was trying to hold down a threat. Like Denzel wasn't begging, he was growling. Zuri Harper saw it all. She had just stepped out of the bus terminal holding a folder and a coffee she hadn't even sipped yet. She froze when she heard that awful sound. Then she saw the blood. Not imagined. Not secondhand. Real. Thick. Running. "Sir, hey! Hey!" Zuri shouted, her voice cracking into the chill air. "Get off him! He's not resisting!" Beckett didn't so much as look at her. He muttered into his radio. Something about compliance. Something about backup. Zuri took 2 steps forward. Then one more. Her voice rising. "You're hurting him. He's bleeding." And that was it. That was all it took. She reached out, not to attack, not to shove, but to signal for Beckett to stop. Her hand landed on his forearm, light as breath. But Beckett turned like a switch had flipped. In one brutal motion, he grabbed her wrist and yanked it behind her back. "Don't touch an officer," he growled, twisting her arm tighter. "What? What are you doing?" Zuri shouted, shocked. "I was trying to—" "You're interfering with a lawful arrest," he cut her off. "That's obstruction. That's assault." He slammed her forward against the concrete knee, digging into the back of her thigh. Her folder spilled across the sidewalk. Coffee split and pooled near Denzel's blood. "You have the wrong idea. I didn't attack you." Zuri struggled not to escape, but just to speak. "I saw you reach for me!" Beckett barked, already snapping the cuffs closed. From across the street, a boy, maybe 10, maybe 11, filmed everything behind the safety of a car door. His hands shook, but he didn't look away. Zuri gritted her teeth as the cuffs cut into her wrists. Her chest heaved. She looked down. Denzel was still motionless, still cuffed, still bleeding, and no one else stepped in. By the time backup arrived, the radio was already calling it in. Female suspect, black, early 30s, interfered with officer in process, possible assault. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask what happened. They already knew the story they were writing. At the precinct, it was cold. Not just the walls, the air, the silence. The way the officer at booking didn't even glance up when he asked, "Emergency contact, anyone to call?" Zuri looked him straight in the eye. Her voice didn't shake. "Let them see me as just another defendant," she said. He paused for half a second, then wrote down refused contact. In the corner of the booking room, a television played muted news. No one turned the volume up. Outside, the sun had started to fall. The coffee stain on her pants was already drying. And somewhere on a boy's phone, the truth sat quietly waiting. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your ribs. Not because the room was quiet, courtrooms are never truly quiet, but because no one dared to breathe too loud. Not with her walking in. Zuri Harper stepped across the threshold with her head held high, but even she could feel it. The pause in every movement, the tightening of every neck muscle as eyes shifted toward her like she didn't belong in the same air. They looked at her not like a threat, but like a challenge to their comfort. A disruption in a room built for order. Reporters sat in the back, not talking, not smiling, just watching. One of them adjusted her recorder with a snap, not to capture what was said, but to mark the moment Zuri entered. Others scribbled already headlines forming in their heads before anyone spoke. She took her seat at the defense table, hands folded, jaw locked tight. She didn't look toward the bench. Not yet. Then the door behind the platform opened, and in walked Judge Raymond Bell. You didn't need a bio to understand him. He wore authority like a badge, like a second skin. White, mid-60s. Face set like stone. The kind of man who believed the room belonged to him the moment he breathed in it. And no one, not even the law, would tell him otherwise. He didn't look at Zuri when he sat, just adjusted his robe, nodded once, and opened the file in front of him like it was already beneath his interest. The bailiff called it out like scripture. Superior Court of Fulton County is now in session. The People versus Zuri Harper. Judge Bell barely glanced up. Charged with obstruction and felony assault on a peace officer, he said, voice sharp and dry. Miss Harper, do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor, Zuri answered. Clear, calm, controlled. Plea, not guilty. That was when he finally looked at her. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. A measuring stare from a man who had already decided what box she belonged in. The prosecutor stood. Jason Holland. Navy suit, slick smile, voice smooth like polished steel. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to bury. He stepped forward slowly, like he'd been waiting for this moment all morning. The defendant, Miss Harper, knowingly interfered in the lawful arrest of a non-compliant suspect. She crossed into an active police operation. She ignored verbal warnings. She made physical contact with an officer in the process of securing a subject who had already shown aggression. Her behavior was not only dangerous, it was deliberate. He turned to face the room, letting the words settle like fog. Intent matters, Your Honor. So does accountability. The defense may call it compassion, but the law sees it for what it was, recklessness. Craigson stood next, older than Zuri, calmer than most. His eyes flicked to hers once before he spoke. Not to reassure her, to respect her. We request a continuance, he said. The prosecution has not provided the full surveillance footage of the incident. Additional eyewitness testimony is still pending. My client has a constitutional right to a fair defense. That requires context, not just accusation. Judge Bell closed the folder slowly, deliberately. No, he said. Craigson straightened. Respectfully, Your Honor, the defense cannot adequately prepare while the state withholds material evidence. Bell's voice cut through like a blade. She had context, he said. She chose to ignore it. She stepped into something that wasn't hers to manage, and now we're pretending this is some grand misunderstanding. Then he looked at Zuri again. If she truly believed in justice, he said she wouldn't have disrupted it. There was a long, sour pause. No one in the gallery moved. Someone coughed in the back, then stopped short. Zuri didn't blink, didn't speak, but her knuckles tightened on the edge of the table. Craigson took a slow breath, but he didn't argue further. He knew when a wall refused to move. The judge shifted forward. This case proceeds. No delays, no distractions. Expediency is justice. He picked up his gavel not to strike it, but to remind the room who held it. Zuri sat back down slow and deliberate, not defeated, calculating. Across the aisle, a young journalist stopped writing, just sat there watching her, pen frozen mid-air. There was something in Zuri's silence now. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of silence that waits until the floorboards start cracking. The courtroom wasn't built for people like her to speak. It was built to make them small, to frame their voices with rules, timing, procedure, until the weight of it all made the truth sound like noise. But Zuri Harper spoke anyway. She sat straight eyes, steady voice, calm. No theatrics, just facts. I didn't step in to make a scene. I stepped in because I saw a man bleeding. I didn't hit anyone. I told an officer to stop pressing his knee into another man's spine. That's not assault. That's being human. Her words didn't crack, didn't falter, but they pushed against something invisible in the room. Judge Raymond Bell had been flipping through paperwork, but at that sentence he slammed the folder shut and leaned forward, voice low but sharp as a lash. This narrative, he said, borders on fiction. The air turned tight. People stilled in their seats. Even the reporters stopped typing for a beat. Craigson stood quickly, smoothing his tie out of instinct, like trying to keep the peace. Your Honor, the defendant is offering her first-hand account. Bell raised a hand without looking at him. She's lying, he said louder this time. And I will not let this court become a soapbox for personal agendas. This is a courtroom, not a protest rally. Zuri blinked once. That was all. Then slowly she stood. Permission to respond, Your Honor. Bell didn't answer. Zuri took that silence for what it was. She stepped out from behind the table and faced the bench, not with arrogance, but with the calm defiance of someone who's already paid for speaking up. I am not a liar, she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. You don't know me, but you decided who I was the moment I walked in. Bell leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. "You're out of line." "No, sir," she said, eyes locked on him. "What's out of line is calling me a liar in a courtroom where the full video hasn't even been presented." Her voice rose, not shouting, but sharp enough to leave an echo. "You're not upset because I raised my voice. You're upset because I saw something you've spent your career pretending isn't real." The room froze. Not a murmur, not a cough, just stillness. Even the ceiling fans seemed to hesitate. Craigson took a step toward her, whispering, "Zuri, sit down." "Please." But she didn't, not yet. "You say I had an agenda. You're damn right I do. My agenda was keeping a man from dying in front of a dozen bystanders who did nothing. If that offends your courtroom, then maybe it's the courtroom that's broken." A gasp escaped somewhere in the gallery. One of the reporters, female mid-30s, with eyes like a camera lens, stopped writing and just watched her now. Really watched. Judge Bell's knuckles were white against the wood of the bench. "Sit down, Miss Harper," he hissed. Zuri held the judge's stare for a second longer than she should have. Then she nodded once, cool, deliberate, and returned to her seat. The room didn't exhale. It just shifted like the floor had tilted ever so slightly in her direction. Craigson didn't say a word. He simply adjusted his papers, but there was something different in the way his hand paused, like even he hadn't expected that fire from her. Not yet. And for the first time since the trial began, no one looked at Zuri like a headline. They looked at her like a warning. Like a woman they couldn't predict. Like someone who might still have cards left to play. There's something cruel about silence in a courtroom. Not the silence of order, but the kind that settles when someone decides to dig up your past and throw it on the floor like a weapon. Jason Holland, the prosecutor, rose with a slow precision that made his intent obvious long before he opened his mouth. "Your Honor," he said, flipping to the final tab in his binder. "The defense paints Miss Harper as a concerned citizen. But concern alone doesn't explain a history of defiance." He held up a printed document, shaking it once before reading. At age 16, the defendant was remanded to juvenile correctional custody following an incident where she physically assaulted a public school teacher. The order was signed by the Attorney General of the state, her own mother, Alyssa Harper. A wave moved through the room. Subtle, but it was there. The kind of sound a crowd makes when truth and scandal meet in the same breath. Zuri didn't flinch. She didn't glance at Craigson. She didn't even sigh. She stood up again, slow, deliberate, not out of defiance this time, but responsibility. "That's true," she said, voice even. "I was 16. Angry. Tired. Fed up. A teacher told a boy in my class that black girls only knew how to fight or get pregnant. I told her she was wrong. When she grabbed my wrist, I slapped her." Another hush rolled across the room, but this time no one reached for outrage. "I was suspended," Zuri continued. "Then expelled. My mother recused herself from the review, but when the case reached her desk anyway, she signed the order for me to be sent to a juvenile correctional facility." Her eyes didn't look for sympathy, only understanding. "That was the first time justice walked into my home," she said softly, and it didn't blink. For a moment her voice caught, not from weakness, but memory. "I remember the day she drove me to that place. Not a guard, not an assistant. Her. She parked outside, sat in silence. And just before I got out of the car, she turned to me, held my face in her hands, and said," Zuri closed her eyes for a brief second, and then repeated it like a line carved into her bones. "Justice isn't for comfort. It's for correction." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The memory alone was weight enough. The courtroom didn't know what to do with that kind of truth. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It just sat there, quiet, heavy, inescapable. Craigson leaned forward, not to interrupt, but to lend stillness. Support without words. And for the first time, the jury looked at Zuri not like a defendant, but like a story that hadn't finished being told. One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s with graying curls, shifted in her seat, arms folded tighter, not in judgment, but in reflection. Another leaned forward slightly, as if trying to see Zuri more clearly. Judge Bell said nothing. He didn't interrupt. But the way he tapped his gavel base quietly, absently betrayed something. Discomfort. Because Zuri wasn't just another angry voice anymore. She was someone who had bled for the very system she stood inside now. Someone who didn't learn the law from books, but from bruises. From ink on a court order signed by a mother who believed in justice more than protection. From that day forward, no one in that courtroom could claim she didn't understand what justice meant. She had lived it, even when it broke her. No one expected him to show up not like that. Denzel Moore, the man everyone thought would disappear like most ghosts of the system do, stepped into the courtroom wearing an oversized gray jacket, one sleeve wrinkled at the elbow, the other clinging too close. His hair was trimmed, his beard cleaner than before, but the white gauze taped across his temple reminded everyone of how this began. Some in the gallery squinted, unsure if it was really him. Others leaned in as though watching a ghost reclaim his name. Craigston stood firm but respectful. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present a new witness. This is Mr. Denzel Moore, the individual involved in the original arrest." Judge Bell arched a brow, removed his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This should have been disclosed prior to today." "We only located him 2 nights ago," Craigston replied. "He came forward on his own, and he brought something with him." Bell gave a reluctant nod. A monitor flickered on, and the courtroom went still. The footage was unsteady, shot from low behind a pillar, but clear enough. You could see Denzel pinned to the sidewalk. Then Zuri's figure stepped forward, her arms out, voice raised not in rage but urgency. You saw her hand stretch toward the officer Beckett right before he spun and threw her down. The air thickened. Even the reporters paused their typing. Bell's voice came sharp and cold. "This is inadmissible. The chain of custody has not been maintained. There is no timestamp, no verified source." Craigston took a step forward. "The footage may not be perfect, but it aligns with sworn testimony. And the man who bled that day, he's right here." Denzel didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward, not angry, not defiant, just tired. He held his worn cap in his hands like a peace offering no one had asked for. "You called her a liar," he said softly. Bell's eyes narrowed. "I heard you. So did everybody else." The room held its breath. "She didn't swing, she didn't curse. She stepped in. And you're mad about that." He turned to face the jury, then to Zuri, his voice gaining weight. "I've been invisible most of my life. People pass me on the street like I'm just another bag of trash. Cops see me and figure I'm either drunk or dangerous. That day she saw me. She saw a human being." He paused, letting the words settle. "You call that reckless, maybe. But it wasn't a lie. Not when my blood's still in the cracks of that curb." Zuri's hands tightened in her lap. She felt her throat close, but she didn't cry. Not here, not yet. She looked at Denzel and thought if the world had even half his clarity, maybe none of us would need to be this brave. The gallery shifted again. One juror, an older black man with silver hair and a tired suit, blinked twice, folded his arms, and leaned back like he was seeing the case in a different light for the first time. Bell cleared his throat and tapped the gavel once too softly to mean anything. "Mr. Moore, your remarks have been noted, but your video is not admissible. You may step down." Denzel gave no protest. He simply looked at Zuri and nodded. A small, silent acknowledgement between two people who had shared a moment the system refused to understand. He turned and walked out, no handcuffs, no outbursts, just a quiet, heavy exit. As he passed the last bench, the young reporter lowered her pen and just watched him. Zuri sat in silence, her mind ringing. But it wasn't confusion. It was memory. Echoes of that day on the street, and now this one inside 4 walls built for justice but hardened by denial. She thought of what her mother once told her. Justice doesn't need to comfort you. It needs to convict you. Maybe that was true, but tonight Zuri knew something else too. Sometimes justice has to bleed before people see it, and right now its blood was still drying outside the courthouse. The courtroom was still quiet from Denzel Moore's haunting words when Zuri took the stand once more. She moved with a calm that wasn't performance. It was survival. The kind of stillness that only people who've been punished for their truth know how to wear. Craigston rose again, slower this time. His tone was less formal now, more human. "Zuri," he said, pausing just enough to make the room listen. "Why didn't you just keep walking that day?" For a moment she didn't answer. Her gaze dropped not from shame, but from memory. It was clear this wasn't just a courtroom to her anymore. It was something older, something deeper. "There was a time," she began slowly, "when I thought silence meant safety. That if I kept my head down, if I walked past, I wouldn't be seen, and that meant I wouldn't be hurt. But silence didn't protect anyone that day. Not the man on the sidewalk. And not me." Craigston nodded slightly, but said nothing more. He knew when to stay quiet. Zuri took a breath, this one deeper, sharper. When I was 12, she said I was waiting after school with my best friend, Brielle. Her dad was late to pick her up. When he finally pulled up in his truck, 2 officers were already there. They said he matched a description. Her voice held no tremor, but her fingers twitched slightly on the edge of the wooden stand. They dragged him from the truck in front of us, in front of the teachers, in front of people with cell phones, with voices, with choices. And they hit him. Not because he resisted, because they could. She paused, her eyes not focusing on anything in particular. No one said a word. Not the crossing guard, not the principal, not even my own mother when I told her later. We all just watched. Her next breath came more slowly. 2 days later, Mr. Carter died. Internal bleeding. They said it was an accident, that it was complicated, that maybe he had a history. The courtroom was utterly still. I remember standing there on that sidewalk, frozen. And the worst part wasn't the sirens or the shouting. It was the silence, the way people looked away, the way I looked away. She turned to Craigson now. So when I saw Officer Beckett that day, when I saw him forcing that man down with blood on the pavement, I didn't even think. I just heard myself scream. A whisper broke the silence in the back row. A court staffer blinked fast, her hand brushing a tear away. Zuri's voice dropped a little lower. I screamed, not because I wanted to be brave, not because I planned to start something. I screamed because I remembered what happens when nobody else does. Her words settled like dust in the air, slow, heavy, impossible to ignore. Craigson glanced at Judge Bell, then looked back to Zuri. Have you ever shared this story before? She gave the smallest shake of her head. No, not in court. Not even to most of my friends. But I've lived with it every day. Her hand lightly touched the bench as if grounding herself. I've seen what silence protects, and I've seen what it destroys. She looked directly at Bell. I may not have followed procedure that day, but I followed something else. Something that doesn't get written into reports or court rulings. I followed my conscience. Bell's face remained unreadable, but something in his posture softened barely but enough for the gallery to notice. Zuri continued. People say silence is golden. But to me, silence is what killed Mr. Carter. It's what nearly buried the truth that day, and I wasn't going to let it happen again, not if I had a voice left in me. Another long pause. I screamed, Your Honor, because no one else did. No one dared speak. Even Craigson didn't offer a closing remark. He simply gave her a slight nod and stepped back. From the gallery, a reporter's pen hovered in midair, still forgotten. The sound of a chair creaking echoed like thunder. For the first time in the entire trial, Judge Raymond Bell said nothing. No objection, no sarcasm, no accusation. He just sat there, eyes narrowed not with disdain but thought. Like a man seeing something he wasn't prepared to reckon with. Zuri stepped down from the stand and returned to her seat. Not triumphant, not defiant, but centered. And for a moment, even without a gavel striking or a witness bursting into tears, you knew the tide had shifted. She had entered this courtroom as a defendant. But in that moment, she became something more. The courtroom had just begun to settle when the prosecutor rose, papers in hand and confidence sharpening his tone. Your Honor, he said with the theatrical calm of a man holding back a smirk. Before we continue, the people would like to submit a piece of clarifying information for the record. Judge Bell raised an eyebrow but motioned for him to proceed. The prosecutor turned to face the room, holding up the document with slow precision, like he knew exactly what he was about to detonate. Zuri Harper, he said loud enough for the back rows to hear, is the daughter of the current Attorney General, Alyssa Harper. The words dropped like glass on concrete. A hush swept through the gallery, then cracked open with murmurs, gasps, and shuffling. Reporters shot up straighter in their seats. A camera from the local news station whirred to life. Even the bailiff blinked twice. Judge Bell leaned back slowly in his chair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other tapping against the bench. Well, he said with the kind of slow, amused disdain that curled at the edges of his lips that explains the performance. Craigson started to rise in protest, but Zuri gently touched his sleeve, stopping him. She didn't flinch, didn't sink into the seat. Instead, she stood up calmly, as if the accusation was just another gust of wind on a path she'd already chosen to walk. Her voice was even, not defensive, not ashamed, just clear. Yes, she said. Alyssa Harper is my mother. The room buzzed again, but she didn't pause. And that's exactly why I never mentioned her name. Bell's eyebrow twitched. Oh, you expected us to believe that had no bearing on this case. Zuri's eyes met his, not with challenge, but with quiet weight. I didn't want to be obeyed, Your Honor. I wanted to be heard. She let the words settle. Not shouted, not wrapped in drama, just the truth. I walked into this courtroom knowing exactly what people would assume if they knew who my mother was. That I must be entitled, protected, handed immunity like a family heirloom. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be treated like anyone else. Because if justice can't stand without a name behind it, then it isn't justice at all. Craigson watched her not as an attorney now, but as a man seeing a client step beyond his defense. The prosecutor spoke it again, though this time with a little less bite in his voice. And yet, you hit it. Zuri turned to face him, her posture still firm. I didn't hide. I just didn't announce. There's a difference. He frowned slightly but couldn't quite respond. And then Zuri did something unexpected. She looked out over the courtroom not with a plea, but with presence. I know what it looks like, she said. A woman like me standing here saying what I said, doing what I did. And now, suddenly, the daughter of someone powerful. But this, she gestured toward the bench, toward the cameras. This isn't about who raised me. It's about what I believe. Her voice dipped low again, the way it always did when she was telling something honest. My mother taught me to fear silence more than failure. And if I've failed in your eyes today, at least, I did it speaking. There was no applause, no gasp, just a pause. A thick, heavy breath that the room took as one body. Judge Bell leaned forward slightly, studying her. For once, he didn't have a snide comment ready. And that perhaps said more than any verdict ever could. No one saw it coming, not even Craigson. It happened just after a recess when the air still felt unsettled from the revelation of Zuri's bloodline. Reporters buzzed like bees around a hive. Judge Bell had returned to the bench with a smug calm, as if the chaos had finally been reined in. That's when the bailiff brought in a sealed folder, a slim manila folder with a single document inside. The prosecutor opened it casually, then froze. His brows drew together in slow confusion. Your Honor, he said, standing again. This time slower, more cautious. The court has just received a document relevant to the integrity of this trial. Bell leaned forward, tapping his fingers. Proceed. The prosecutor cleared his throat the way people do when they sense the floor shifting beneath them. It's a formal petition, he said, filed with the Civilian Review Board, requesting a full investigation into Officer John Beckett's use of force in prior arrests. The courtroom murmured again, low and unsure. Judge Bell raised a hand. That alone does not concern this case. Respectfully, Your Honor. The prosecutor continued. The petitioner is listed as Z.C. Harper. He paused, then added slowly, filed 2 weeks before the incident. That landed. Craigson turned his head so fast it looked like he'd missed a step in the narrative. You submitted this? He asked Zuri, barely above a whisper. Zuri didn't answer right away. She stood up quietly and looked not at Craigson, not at Bell, but at the jury. I did, she said, before any of this happened, before I was handcuffed, before it was personal. Craigson was still staring at her, not with disapproval, but with a kind of astonishment that comes when you realize the person you're defending may have been 2 steps ahead of you the whole time. Bell narrowed his eyes. You're telling this court you had an active petition against Officer Beckett at the time of the incident and failed to disclose it. Zuri didn't blink. I wasn't trying to hide it. But I wasn't going to let it be used to turn this into a vendetta either. Craigson finally found his voice. Your Honor, this alters the nature of this trial significantly. If my client had filed formal concerns against the arresting officer before the incident, it proves motive not for her, but for him. The courtroom grew quiet again, like the air itself was holding its breath. Bell shifted in his seat. He looked at the clerk, then the prosecutor, then Zuri. He knew the law, knew what it meant when the accuser and accused switched places in the record books. His gavel hovered over the desk, not striking yet, as if hoping a better path might suddenly appear. Then he said almost through his teeth, This court is compelled to acknowledge a potential conflict of interest. We will adjourn for 36 hours. The Civilian Review Board will be contacted immediately. He banged the gavel hard. The room erupted. Reporters bolted out the door. The jury was escorted out faster than they came in. Beckett stood in the back of the room, jaw clenched so tight his cheeks twitched. His hands balled into fists at his sides. Zuri didn't move. Not yet. She stood there, eyes still calm, the storm around her building, while she remained centered, anchored not by power, but by truth. Craigson leaned toward her, half whispering, You never told me about the petition. Why? Zuri finally looked at him. Because I needed this case to be about what he did, she said softly. Not about what I planned. Craigsson exhaled through his nose, shook his head once, and offered a quiet smile. I don't know whether to be furious or impressed. Try both, she said, and sat back down. The courtroom was packed again. Same faces, same tension, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't nervous anymore. It was expectant, like the entire room had run out of reasons to breathe until one man said one thing. Judge Raymond Bell sat high above the rest posture, stiff, but his eyes moved slower now. For once, his voice didn't come down like a hammer. It came like a stone placed quietly on a table. After review of the submitted petition, he began, and upon consideration of the supplemental testimony and evidentiary inconsistencies, he paused. His gaze flickered toward Zuri but didn't stay there. This court finds the defendant Zuri Camille Harper not guilty on all charges. No one moved. There were no gasps, no cries of relief, not even the shuffle of paper. Just the sound of one chair creaking as someone leaned forward, perhaps unsure if they'd heard right. Zuri stood up slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse in gratitude like the movies show. She simply looked forward. Her shoulders relaxed, her chin slightly lifted. And when Bell gestured toward her, as if to dismiss her from the stand, she didn't walk away. She spoke. I didn't come for a victory, she said. And her voice didn't rise above the courtroom's walls, but it cut through every layer of it. I came for a reckoning. For a brief moment, Bell seemed as if he might interrupt her again, but he didn't. He sat back in his chair. Zuri turned to the gallery. Not all eyes were on her. Some people still looked down. Others scribbled notes, but one or two, perhaps the ones who'd doubted her most, were now watching with a different kind of attention. One quiet nod from an older black man in the back row. A stillness in the eyes of a juror who'd barely blinked through the entire trial. And a woman in a press pass who didn't even bother writing, just listened. Zuri didn't wait for applause. There wasn't any. No one cheered, and that somehow felt right. Because this wasn't a triumph, it was a correction. Justice hadn't sung. It had whispered. As she stepped down from the stand, Craigsson moved to follow her, but then stopped himself. He knew this moment wasn't his to share. He stayed behind, watching her walk past the clerk's table, past the jury box, and out through the doors that just a week ago had slammed shut behind her in handcuffs. No flashing lights awaited her outside. No press mobbed her with microphones. Just wind, and the sound of footsteps not echoing behind her for once. Inside the courtroom, Judge Bell remained seated long after everyone else had begun to clear out. His fingers traced the edge of the bench slowly, as if trying to recall some early version of himself that had believed this job was about fairness, not control. But if he felt anything, he didn't show it. He just sat there, a figure in a robe who had finally run out of ways to dodge the mirror Zuri held up to him. Some truths don't need thunder to land. They just need time to settle. And in that room full of voices now gone quiet, something had settled. Not a celebration, a shift. And that perhaps was the point. The courthouse doors didn't slam when they closed behind her. They just clicked like a chapter ending with no punctuation, but silence. Zuri Harper stepped out into the early evening light, not as a defendant, not as the Attorney General's daughter, but as someone who had stood her ground and didn't flinch. She didn't expect applause, and she didn't get it. The reporters had already moved on to louder headlines. Most of the spectators had filed out without so much as a nod. But there was something different in the air, quiet but charged, like the way the wind feels right before a storm finally passes. Then from the far end of the steps came a voice, small, curious, sincere. Are you famous now? Zuri turned her head. It was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, with a too large hoodie and too wide eyes. He was holding a cheap phone, the kind that barely recorded but had been pointed at the courthouse for the past hour. She paused before walking over. She knelt just enough so they met eye to eye. No, she said with a tired but honest smile. But I was louder than fear. Just once. That's enough. The boy looked at her like he was memorizing something important, not just her words, but the way she said them. Then he nodded almost solemnly and ran off without another word. Zuri stood again. The wind picked up, slightly brushing loose hair across her cheeks. She took one breath, then another, and began walking. Not toward a car, not toward anyone waiting just forward. A few days passed mostly in stillness. She didn't rush to speak publicly. She didn't post anything online. What needed to be said had already been spoken under oath under pressure in a courtroom that had tried to break her. But people noticed. A quiet email came from a small nonprofit hosting a community forum on judicial reform. Would she come speak not as anyone's daughter, just as herself? She said yes. It wasn't a grand stage. The community center had flickering lights and fold-up chairs, no news cameras, no elaborate banners, just a hand-painted sign behind the lectern, "Justice is not a theory, it's a fight." When Zuri stepped up to the mic, a hush fell over the room. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't unfold prepared notes. She just began. I didn't speak out that day because I was looking for trouble. I spoke because I saw a man's head bleeding on the sidewalk while no one said a word. She let that hang in the air. I've seen that silence before. At 12 years old, I watched a friend's father beaten while the neighborhood pretended not to hear. That silence never left me. So when I saw it happening again, I wasn't brave. I was fed up. A few people nodded slowly. One older woman whispered, like she'd lived it too. And yes, Zuri continued. I knew what the judge didn't, that I was the Attorney General's daughter. But I didn't use that name, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed to know if truth alone could stand, even when stripped of protection. She looked around the room. The quiet wasn't discomfort anymore. It was attention. Deep, unshaken, deliberate attention. I didn't come for applause. And I didn't leave with victory. But I stood. And that for me was enough. The room stayed quiet. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Soon the whole room was on its feet, not cheering but clapping slowly. With purpose. With weight. The kind of sound that says, "We heard you. And we won't forget." That night, a grainy clip of her speech recorded on an old phone from the second row made its way online. Not millions of views, but enough. Enough to start a conversation somewhere it hadn't started before. And that's where the story settled. Because Zuri Harper wasn't saved by her last name. She didn't win because she had power behind her. She stood alone when it would have been easier to stay quiet. And that choice to speak, to risk, to stay became its own kind of legacy. Just enough to be heard. Sometimes standing up doesn't mean shouting the loudest. It just means not stepping back when it matters most. Zuri's story isn't about titles or power. It's about courage in the quiet moments, the kind that challenges systems, stirs hearts, and speaks truth even when no one claps. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful stories that shed light on justice, dignity, and the strength we carry within. Your support means the world to us. Every share, every new subscriber gives our team the motivation to keep bringing you the stories that matter, the ones that remind us who we are and what we still need to fight for. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember the ones no one else dares to tell.